What's up guys, this is Joe with J Blake Photo. This is going to be the first video in a series of videos, specifically 3 videos on the triangle of light, or the exposure triangle, or the triangle of exposure, which is going to be part of a larger series, a larger project, about the fundamentals of photography. I don't call them the basics of photography because, to be quite honest, they're not very basic, but these are the fundamentals to help you get the shot that you want to get with your gear every time. If you're interested in videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Go ahead and hit the notification bell so you get notifications whenever I post new videos. And if there's a video that you'd specifically like to see as a part of this series, or any particular topics that you want me to cover, then go ahead and leave me a comment down below, or hit me up on Twitter. I'm at @JBlakePhotog, or any one of my other social media links down below in the description. Okay, so the triangle of light, the triangle of exposure, the exposure triangle, what is it? It's the relationship between the 3 most important tools that a photographer can use to increase or decrease the amount of light that you have access to. Now, there are a number of reasons why this is important, but really you can boil it down to 2 specific reasons. Number 1, you have to be able to control the light coming into your camera to match the look that you want. Silhouette, high key, low key, freezing motion, motion blur, shallow focus, sharp focus, more noise, less noise. These all relate directly to the triangle of exposure. And second, you want a good exposure, and you need to know how to adjust these settings to get the best exposure possible. I think Peter McKinnon said it best.
Because bright pixels equal sharp pixels.
So where do we start? Let's start with what I think is probably the most complicated part of the triangle of exposure, which is aperture. When we start talking about aperture, we have to answer one question first, which is, what is a stop? You've heard this used in photography: stop it down, stop it up, f-stop. What is a stop? F has to do with math. There's a function, it's a math equation. I'm not going to bore you with it, but we call it an f-stop when it's related to aperture. Stops are normally measured by doubling or halving a number to increase or decrease the amount of light that you have coming into your camera. So if you were to, for example, reduce your stop by 1, reduce by 1 stop, you would be, in essence, stopping down or cutting the amount of light that's coming into your camera, the amount of light that you have to work with, by 1/2. Now, you can do that in a couple of different ways along the exposure triangle. You have a lot of different tools to work with. In this video, we're going to concentrate on doing it with the aperture. So the first thing to know about aperture is that lower is more. Less is more. If you come away with anything from this video, just know that when it comes to aperture, lower equals more light. So how is it measured? Let's talk about the lens that I'm actually using to shoot this video right now. This is a 17 to 40 millimeter f4 lens, and I'm currently shooting at f4. So we want to concentrate on f4. So going down from f4 to a lower number would increase the amount of light that I would let into my camera through the lens. And when we describe that, we describe it as an f-stop. So f4 is an f-stop measurement. F-stops are measured as the ratio between the diameter inside the lens at its smallest point, so the smallest hole that light can get through, and the focal length, or the length of the lens, the length that light needs to travel through before it gets from the end of your lens to the inside of your camera where the sensor or your film plane is located. If we remember from school, a ratio is a fraction. So as a fraction, if we had a lens that was 100 millimeters long, and we had a diameter inside that was 50 millimeters, we could express that lens as having a 2-to-1 ratio, or f2. Will you ever have to do this math? No, but it's nice to know where it comes from. So what if we went from that same 100 millimeter focal length lens and a 50 millimeter diameter to a 25 millimeter diameter? Well, that would go from being f2 to f4. If you got that right, then you won the home game. So let's talk about the different stops or measurements along the scale. We'll start with f1 because it's simple. There are not a whole lot of f1 lenses out there. Most of them tend to be manual, they're very rare, and they're very expensive. The reason that they're rare and expensive and manual is because normally to get a diameter that is equal to the focal length of your lens, you normally don't have a lot of room for things like autofocus, image stabilization, and it's mostly just glass in there. They're also really hard to engineer, so they get really expensive, and you can only make so many of them that actually come out being high quality. So if we went from f1, then the next number along the scale should be f2, right? Wrong. The next stop along the scale is actually f1.4. Now I can hear the groans and the moans from the internet. Let me explain. Because we're dealing with circles, we're actually able to let in twice as much light by increasing the opening by only 140%, which is why when we go from 1 to 1.4, we actually double the amount of light that's let into the camera. And remember, a stop is a doubling of light. So from 1 to 1.4 is a doubling of light. Then from 1.4, we go to 2. From 2, we go to 2.8. And from 2.8, we go to 4. These measurements are probably things you've seen before. Now remember, as we go up in the scale, the amount of light goes down by half for each stop. So 1.4 has half as much light as 1, 2 has half as much light as 1.4, and 2.8 has half as much light as 2, and so on. But that also means that it works the same way going in the opposite direction. So if we go from f8 to f5.6, we double the amount of light that we're bringing into our camera. From 5.6 to 4 is another double. From 4 to 2.8 is another double. So going from f8 to f5.6 and then to f4 is actually a quadrupling of the amount of light that you're letting into your camera. Fractional stops. So you probably see numbers along the scale that you didn't hear me mention. Things like f1.8, f2.4, f6.3. So you actually have stops along the scale that maybe you've seen often on other lenses. An example is my favorite lens, the Canon 50mm f1.8. This is a great little lens, and it's a 1.8 aperture, which you didn't see along the scale. That's because this is actually a 3/4 stop between f1.4 and f2.0, which are both whole stops. Do you have to worry about that? No. All you have to know is that this brings in more light than an f2.8 and less light than an f1.2. So now we understand that a lower aperture means more light. More light equals better light, and that light doubles as we go down from stop to stop, or gets cut in half as we go up from stop to stop. So that's it, right? We're done? Unfortunately, not quite. As we'll discover when we look at other parts of the exposure triangle, each adjustment that we make has at least one or two other impacts on our composition. When it comes to exposure, as we adjust this figure, the other thing that changes is our focus. So let's talk about focus really quickly. As light enters the camera, certain areas of the frame are in focus and certain are not. Even if you're looking at a completely blurry frame, some distance between your camera and whatever it is you're shooting is in focus. And that's how focus is measured, in distance. Some lenses even have distance meters on them. This Canon zoom lens, for example, has a distance meter on it. As I change the focus, you can actually see that it will focus all the way down to 1.2 meters, and it tells me exactly how far away things will be in focus. I can also focus all the way out to infinity and every distance in between. So when you're focusing on an individual subject, you're not actually focusing on the subject itself. You're focusing on the distance between you and that subject. So here's where aperture comes into play with focus. As you change your aperture on your camera, it will not just adjust how much light is brought into your camera, but it will also adjust what's called the plane of focus. The plane of focus is a measurement from when something becomes in focus to when it stops being in focus. So between you and infinity is your object. And there is a distance between your camera and your plane of focus, where things start to be in focus. Then you have your subject. Then you'll have the end of your plane of focus, when things become out of focus again, off into infinity. The distance between the beginning of focus and the end of focus, with your subject somewhere hopefully in the middle, is called the plane of focus. Now, the larger that the aperture is on your camera, meaning the more open it is, the more light that you're receiving in your camera, the smaller this number will be, the thinner the plane of focus. Now you can actually measure this. There are calculations that can help figure it out, and they'll take into account how far away you are from a subject, the focal length of your camera, the aperture of the camera that you have it set to, the size of your sensor. But just remember this, when it comes to aperture, the larger your aperture is or the lower your f-stop is, the smaller the plane of focus will be. And the more out of focus those out of focus things will be. Here's an example. If I was photographing an object on my desk, like my glasses, and I were to shoot them at f4, f2, and f8, you would see a considerable difference in how much is in and out of focus. So why is this important? Because there's gonna be a situation where you want as much light into your camera as possible. You just wanna crank that thing open and get maximum light. But when you do that, you need to keep in mind that you are reducing the size of your focus plane so thinly that you'll need to pay special attention to make sure that the things that you're focusing on are actually in focus. The other reason is that it might have something to do with what you're photographing. You may want that plane of focus to be very small or very large. When shooting portraits, it's very nice to have a thin plane of focus. That allows you to have your subject in focus, but have the background be nice and blurry. You'll sometimes hear these blurry areas described as bokeh or bokeh. I'll do a whole nother video on bokeh and why it can be very important in your photos and videos. Needless to say, you can use that blur to draw attention to the subject that you want people to look at in your photo or video. But you can overdo it sometimes. Imagine taking a portrait photograph of someone and focusing on the tip of their nose, but with an aperture that is so low, with such a wide open f-stop, that you get the nose in focus, but the eyes are out of focus. In other cases, you actually might want the entire frame to be in focus. You might want it to be super sharp and super crisp. An example of this might be a landscape photo where you want to shoot at f8 or f11 or f22. Creating an extremely long plane of focus. There are many reasons to use this tool in your photography and videography. So now I briefly want to talk about some of the terms that you might hear when you're researching apertures. Fixed aperture versus variable aperture zooms. These are lenses that have different aperture figures for different sets along the zoom range. For example, you might have a zoom with something like a 18mm to 105 or 110 millimeter range, and at the widest end of the focal length, that lens might shoot at f3.5 or f2.8. But when zoomed in, it might go to f4 or f5.6. This is due to the construction and the internal design of the lens. Fixed aperture zooms don't do this. They stay at the exact same aperture along the entire length of the zoom range. This lens that I used as an example before is a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, but it remains at f2.8 through the entire zoom range. Fixed aperture zooms tend to be more expensive and higher quality glass. This is because they require more engineering and design to construct. Fast lenses. A fast lens is a lens that can be shot at a very low f-stop, or has a large aperture opening. Fast lenses are normally considered lenses that can shoot at 2.8 or lower. They call them fast because you can set a higher shutter speed and still get lots of light into the camera. We'll talk more about how that works when we talk about shutter speed. Fast lenses, especially fast primes, normally go as low as f1.2. But fast primes, especially those with image stabilization and autofocus, like fixed aperture zooms, are very expensive and difficult to build, so they're quite a bit more costly. This Canon 50mm f1.8 you can get for about $120 to $150. The f1.2 version of this lens is over $1,300. They're just harder to make, but you do get twice as much light into the lens for 5 times the cost. It's also a much sharper lens and has considerably better quality glass. And you get kind of dreamlike quality out of its out of focus areas. When we talk about out of focus areas and bokeh specifically, I'll talk more about shutter blades and why they're important. So that's it for this video, which is part 1 in a series about the exposure triangle, the triangle of exposure or the triangle of light, which is part of a larger series of videos about the fundamentals of photography. I'm not calling them the basics of photography because they're not basic. If you like videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, turn that notification bell on so you can see when new videos are added to my channel. In part 2 of this series, we're going to talk about shutter speed and how it plays into the exposure triangle, what it can do for your videos and photos, and how to use it with Aperture to get the shot that you want with the gear that you have. If there's something specific that you'd like to see as a part of this video series, go ahead and type it down in the comments or hit me up on Twitter. I'm at jblakephotog or any one of my social media sites, which are linked down below. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.